Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Holl. This week, I'm talking with Matt Wilson of Zero Gravity in Vermont. And I'll get into it in just a minute, but first, a reminder to check out beeredge.com to sign up for our newsletter where you get behind-the-scenes info on our podcasts as well as original articles. And don't forget about This Week in Rausch Beer, the Facebook group, where we're discussing all kinds of smoked beers and where to find them. So when I first started drinking beer, one of the breweries that opened my eyes and palate to flavor was Magic Hat. Thanks to its number 9, the beer was a fruity pale ale with whimsical labels, clever facts and saying under the bottle caps, and it had a price point that didn't make my budget scream. And of course, a lot has changed in 20 years, and that brewery doesn't dominate the conversation or even register too much to folks anymore. So last year, I wasn't too surprised when the corporate parent company of Magic Hat announced that it would be winding down operations and moving production to upstate New York. The brewery in South Burlington, however, would remain online, and Zero Gravity, a popular Vermont brewery founded in 2004, would be taking over the space. I had only passing memories of Zero Gravity, having visited once or twice, but not for at least the last 5 years. And taking over a well-known spot with a lot of capacity was intriguing, and I meant to reach out earlier, but, the pandemic got in the way. So just after the start of this new year, I was able to call and talk with Matt Wilson. He's the CEO and co-founder of the brewery. And in a state that knows and celebrates its IPA, Zero Gravity, which of course does make hop-forward ales, has put a lot of focus on lagers. It also takes sustainability and growth seriously, and is also looking to the non-alcoholic space as well. We get into it quick, and Matt shares his insights on what the future holds for Zero Gravity. Here's our conversation. Has Vermont's beer culture changed in the last 15 years?
Absolutely. Yeah, the last 15 years in Vermont have been, as I suppose they have just about everywhere else, super exciting. And constantly changing. I think like when you look at beer trends, the beer community, it's practically evolving monthly, daily, seasonally, usually for the better, sometimes for the worse. But, Vermont, thankfully, has been a home to some of the best beers and breweries in the world throughout that last 15 years. And it's certainly been an exciting scene to be a part of. 15 years ago, 2005 is right around when we opened Zero Gravity.
Yeah, that's why I asked. Because, Vermont obviously had a beer culture before you opened, and a pretty robust one and a pretty respected one.
Yeah, no doubt. We're lucky to have our roots in that early culture, too. My business partner and our brewmaster, Paul Saylor, was brewing down at Catamount Brewery in Windsor, Vermont, back in the 90s.
Which is now Harpoon, yeah.
Which is now owned by Harpoon, indeed. Yeah, in fact, they just re-released the Catamount IPA a year or two ago, which I thought was kind of fun to see.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Paul had been part of that early scene, when there was, you probably know better than I, but, just a couple hundred breweries out there. And just, a few in the state of Vermont. I don't know what the number is now, but I think it's over 40, which doesn't sound like a lot, but because Vermont is a pretty small population base, we're still one of the highest per capita. And certainly I think when you talk about the quality of the beer coming out of the state, always been known, I think, to be producing some of the best craft beers.
Yeah, when I think about Vermont, though, especially those early days of Catamount and Vermont Pub and Brewery and, Greg Noonan and what all of these early pioneers in your state did was there's a really firm bedrock of beer tradition and beer respect and beer innovation as well. And so when you all opened up, though, and I guess it's fair to maybe call you like a second generation Vermont brewer, right? Maybe third, yeah. but second I think is probably more accurate.
Wait, which one are we in now, John? Which wave or generation? Just so I can get
well, the hell if I know these days. I mean, generations can be monthly now at this point. It's
right.
Yeah. Oh man, those guys who opened up in November of 2020, God, old men, that kind of thing. But I in thinking about when you opened up, when you did, there was already a tradition there. There was already established breweries that were known all throughout your state, but also in other states, past your borders.
Mm-hmm.
What did you want to be when you opened?
It's a great question. Honestly, when we opened, we were a brew pub, a 10-barrel brew pub located inside American Flatbread here in Burlington, wood-fired pizza place. And, at that time, honestly, like one of our major goals was just educating the general beer drinking public about what great beer was, not even via our products and what we were putting out, but even just like trying to introduce people to great beers of the world. And when we opened that brew pub, we kind of had a 50-50 model of like our beers poured alongside what we viewed as some of the great beers of the region and the world.
Like what?
Because honestly, like at that point in 2005, like there was not a lot of great tap rooms. Like, there wasn't the Three Pennies or the Farmhouse or any of those bars that people know up here now. Yeah. That really became a thing, I think, in the last 10 years where places were sort of like known for this craft beer selection, like you would find at like a wine bar or a cocktail bar. There certainly were some good ones like, in San Francisco and New York and stuff like that. But, here in Burlington, the scene was still pretty young, pretty naive. And like, thinking of, Guinness and some of these other things as like really good beer at the time. Samuel Smith Stout was like, super heady up here because of the scene that was happening. And not to take anything away from those products, but, like the scene itself needed to be educated. And I think, Paul really had his eye on that early on, is like, if we want people to understand what we're doing, we need people to understand just like, what's the baseline for good beer. And so that was like a big part of it. And honestly, it was a fun ride to be on, because at the time I was still learning my chops about beer and was still kind of thinking, the darker the beer, the better kind of thing. And, he opened my eyes to beers like,
that's such a counter argument to a lot of folks who, would say the lighter the beer, the better. Sure.
No doubt. I think a lot of my experiences with craft beer up to that point had been through college and going to concerts on the lot scene and drinking oatmeal stout and things like that. And it was like, different than what I had drank before. If we're talking about like macro lagers, and so, wow, this is different. Like kind of what the IPA signified, I think, to craft beer. It's like different from the yellow fizzy stuff. And so in my mind, how different can I get? Well, the darker the better. That must be the case. And then really understanding like the nuances of great lager and how that's different from, say, Miller or Budweiser or whatever.
Before we get too far down a rabbit hole, though, when you were talking about having world-class beers on tap alongside your own, what rounded out that tap list from beers that you weren't making?
Yeah, great question. Honestly, like thinking back, obviously 15 years ago, it's a little hazy, but on the Vermont side, we didn't represent a lot of like Magic Hat, but we certainly were pouring Switchback. We had McNeil's. We were lucky enough to get McNeil's breweries offerings back then. They were distributing a little bit.
On draft or in those 22 with the cool labels?
We would get them on draft. Yeah, like the Duck
cool.
Breath IPA. And,
that's cool.
Like it was funny. They were like one of the first breweries to set up their own distribution. They kind of identified this little wrinkle in the laws that you could do it if you gave it a different name. And so their guy would show up, every couple of weeks with these crusty looking kegs, but they contained this beer that you couldn't really get anywhere else. So yeah, those, the Vermont scene was very limited at that point. It was like, Long Trail, Magic Hat, Otter Creek, Woolivers. Those
Woolivers.
But nothing that people look at today as being, the Holy Grail of Vermont beer was really being existed at that point. So then we'd be looking at a lot of like Allagash products from the region. We were excited about those. Brewery Omegang. From the world side, I remember, Spaten was regularly available. Vorsteiner, Eyinger. We'd be lucky to get some kegs of Eyinger and things like that. But
All
yeah,
right,
it was a different realm back then for sure.
but that's the interesting thing where you're talking about, like, Spaten, right? Where in 2005, I was 25. So I was, I remember being wowed by Spaten and being like,
Yeah,
holy shit, like this is a great beer. Like, and
yeah.
there's some intangibles to it that I didn't know at the time what they were, because they just weren't revealed to my palate or to my brain yet, kind of thing. But it was like, drinking it, somebody would hand it to me and be like, wow, this tastes good.
When was the last time you had a Spaten?
It's been too long.
Yeah, because I
mean,
haven't had one in ages either. I wonder how it holds up.
yeah, but I think that those beers in our memory from our younger selves do a service to the beers that we drink today. And it's curious to me to hear that, like, you had that on as a pinnacle or something that you had so much respect for that it could take up one of your draft lines. And now you're making lagers. And how much, because Vermont to me in those early days was always almost like the East Coast version of San Diego, where it was like, here we got some dank IPAs, here we have some, some nods towards weed, hop forward, progressional, and be it whatever Greg was doing at Vermont Pub and Brewery or Kimmick or, like whatever, like it was always more of a hop forward place and not Vermont was never a state that I really thought about lagers. So your brewery is pushing that forward now, and so are a bunch of others in your state. But, like, you guys have multi-state distribution on your lagers now. Was there always a need for it and somebody needed to fill that gap, or was that a natural progression of what your local consumers were looking for?
That's a good question too. Honestly, a lot of what we set out to do with lagers was representative of what we were, trying to do with saisons as well. And, mild beers, low alcohol session beers, and, to some degree gruits. We were brewing gruits quite a bit more in those early days.
Did you lose a bet?
Smoked beers. We were.
All right. Well, smoked beers are fine. Everybody who listens to this podcast know that smoked beers are, yeah.
Well, it was funny. Like, one of the first out of state wholesaler agreement we put together was for New York State. We work with Remarkable Liquids down there, and those guys are awesome. They know great beer, and we sort of sat down to talk about what we were gonna, what our plan was. And he goes, "We'll take just about anything you make except for smoked beers or gruits." He's like, we cannot sell those things in the marketplace." And but
I think smoked beers you could get away with today if
today, for sure.
Only because of the the popularity of the This Week in Rausch Beer podcast. But mostly it's gruits are a tough sell.
They really are. I mean, honestly, like, we've had a lot of fun over the years.
Was always the gruit guys were always like the ones who were a little too into going to the Ren Fair every weekend, like, for my tastes.
Yeah, we used to do this funny thing. We did two prominent ones a year, one on the winter solstice and one on the summer solstice. And I'm blaming Paul for this. He went to Hampshire College.
Like, of course you guys did. Of course it was, like, tied to the solstice. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it had to be.
Oh, it's the equinox. Here's our gruit. Yes.
Yeah. We did this whole dog and pony show where we walked the cask of it from one end of Church Street to the other, all banging drums and dressed in fur and carrying torches, just for the spectacle of it all. And a couple of my college friends saw some photos on Facebook of that, and they just, like, never ever let me live it down. It was pretty funny. But yeah, back to the original question, like, what were we doing with lagers then, and how does it fit in with gruits? Basically what we were doing was we were showing one of our strengths, which I think is that pretty much any style that we take on, we can produce. I think in a world-class type of a way. We've always made beautiful saisons. Say what you want about those gruits; they were beautiful beers.
I mean, it's easy to make fun of it, but back in 2005, I mean, it was anything to sort of stand out, and it was anything
Totally.
to buck the establishment, right? I mean, 2005, it was still such a weird place in American beer where you could, oh, we got a beer with no hops in it, and everybody's making hoppy beers, or everybody's making macro lagers, or like, I get why you were doing it. And if they tasted great, like that's cool. Like it's easy to make fun of it now.
No
In
doubt.
sort of a, in a jokey way that's not at all serious or, disparaging your character. But
Yeah, we haven't put out, I don't think, one in the last couple of years, but I tell you what, that Gruit community, they are relentless. So many people will email us.
Sure, it's like five guys.
When's the Gruit coming back?
The Gruit community. No, all right. See, I was going to give you a pass on it, but now you're talking about the Gruit community.
They're out there.
Who's emailing you, and why is it one guy named Tim?
Yeah, he's a really nice guy, though. What can I say?
Like, no, but are there actual people who, like, multiple people that are not just split personalities that are actually reaching out to you and saying,
yeah,
when are you
like
releasing a Gruit again,
like
and please do it in 22 bombers?
Right. It's not exactly. It's not just actually the Gruits. It's always like the funniest, like least, like we made a squash beer called Sasquatch. I don't know. We used to make it at the brew pub every fall or whatever. And thankfully about 5 years ago, I just said, like, guys, we got to retire this. Like, we can't be making pumpkin squash beer anymore. That stuff is just too tired. But again, like every year, when's the Sasquatch? Because like these people just, for some reason, the worst beers are the ones that people just can't let go of. I think I don't know what their plight is, but
I've led you down too many paths at this point. But you saying something is too tired.
Sure.
How do you come to that conclusion? And I want to get back to lagers and why you're making lagers, but
yeah.
I mean, there are some places that put out stuff every year because they're expected to, because they've gotten the customer base used to that. This is what they're going to do. What's the metric in-house that tells you that something is too tired?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, moving from a brew pub model only, which we did for like our first 7 years, 05 to 2012, I think it was.
Yeah.
You wanted a beer, you had to come to Flatbird and drink it there. That shift to now we are packaging beer to be distributed to, all these other places. You get a whole different type of feedback from the customer and what sells and what doesn't sell. If we did a peat smoked IPA one time called Hopscotch, and it was basically like drinking, half IPA, half Lafroig. It was this smoky, hoppy, crazy thing that if you liked any of those flavors, man, you were just in seventh heaven when you sat down and drank this beer. But like, it would take 5 months for that beer to pull through on that tap line. Because there, so few people liked it. If we tried to distribute that beer, people would look like we were crazy. I think like, a beer like a squash beer, the feedback is pretty immediate when the public doesn't want it. You can, like with the Gruits and things like that, pouring them only at the pub. I don't know, you can hand sell it. You can talk to people about it. You can really educate people about what it is. And it's interesting. And you have total control over that story and why you're pouring it, why you think it's important that you try this. And I don't know, it's easier. Once you start to open yourself up to this broader critique or broader public, I think you learn pretty quickly what works and what doesn't. It's pretty clear that, that certain things just don't go over anymore. I think it's really interesting when you see a brewery who's putting out some of the styles now that, have been kind of looked at as being old and in the way, and they get a bunch of attention for it from the beer nerds in their 30s and 40s that sort of miss the days when that stuff was popular again. And I love seeing that. For us, we've really come to focus on certain styles. The Pilsner, the Green State Lager being my favorite. that are pretty trendy right now. IPAs, those are.
I'm laughing because before we started recording, you told me that you were going to be dropping in Green State Lager references, and I'm going to give you a chance to extol its many virtues. But that was subtle. That was good, and I'm not going to let it pass at this point. Like, it's just, yeah.
Well, when you have one of, if not the best beer in the world in your stable of products, it's hard to not talk about it. It's hard to be humble when you have a Green State Lager in your hand, and what can I say? It is that beer. So, yeah.
So, all right, let's get into that, because talking about the best beer in the world, it's a subjective thing, and we're recording this in mid-January of 2021, and who knows where the Republic will be when this actually airs. But like, starting in early November through the end of December, I get a lot of emails where people are like, "Oh, we're gonna do a roundup, and we'd love to know like your best beers, your definitive beers, your desert island beers," and it's just people sort of looking to fill up content and copy, and I can appreciate that. But it is such a subjective thing where, what I like might not be what somebody else is like, versus somebody else, down the line.
It's a beautiful thing about it, isn't it?
It is. So you're saying that, Green State Lager in your mind is, the best beer. Is it ever? Or so in the world, so no other beer touches that.
Correct.
How do you justify the other beers that Zero Gravity makes then?
How do I justify them? Why do we not just produce Green State Lager?
Yeah. Like, why have anything other than the best beer in the world?
Gosh, John, with the hard-hitting questions. Let me take a stab.
Welcome to the Thunderdome, motherfucker. Like, it's
well, because not everybody in the world has the same taste in beer, right? I think that's clear. One of the things that I was actually having a really interesting conversation with a friend last night about, subjectivity, right? And it stemmed from this, I don't know if you've seen this, I don't know if it's on Netflix. It's Fran Lebowitz, produced by Martin Scorsese. I think it's Pretend It's a City or something like that.
I saw a preview for it when we're still catching up on Schitt's Creek. So I saw we're so far. We have a 4-year-old. Like, man, like I get like 35 minutes a day to watch television, and that's not breaking news. So like, it's
right.
Yeah.
Well,
but I've seen it, and I've seen the preview. I want to watch the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, it's hilarious. I mean, if you like her, you're gonna love it. But she was being interviewed by Spike Lee, and he says, talking about like Michael Jordan and how he compares to, say, the finest, painters or musicians or dancers, and like, him saying Michael Jordan's on the same level, right? He's the greatest at what he does. And somebody could say, well, no, it's not the same level. There's no way that basketball is the same thing as Duke Ellington or, somebody in these other fields that they might regard as being, more important. And, that's where it's like, okay, you can have subjectivity around who's the best at something, but then also subjectivity against, okay, what, where do you draw the line? Am I the best dad in the world or the best chef in the world, or, what's more important than the others? And I think, I guess I'm going there because I think, subjectivity of what's the best beer in the world, it does start on some level with what's the most important style of beer in the world. If I'm not stretching that analogy too far, but, in my mind, Pilsner beer, or light lager beer, I guess, not just Pilsners, but, Green State is a Pilsner style, is one of the hardest things in the world to make, right? I mean, this, there's very little to hide behind in that. There's not a bunch of, fragrant dank hops to hide, a malt character that might not be desirable, or not unlike Chardonnay, right? Where you can just sort of,
you haven't added a ton of vanilla.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's one of the hardest things to make well. There's more examples of light lagers, I think, in the world than any other style. I think we've achieved something that I value above just about anything else, which is, balance and drinkability and the desire to have another one. And my my all-time sort of most revered beer drinking moments are those moments where you're passing time with friends, you're drinking, one beer into the next. You're not really thinking about it too much. It's one part of the evening, but not the only part of the evening. And in my mind, Green State Lager fits right into that scene. And for somebody else, that might be, a hop forward IPA or a pasty stout or a crushable, lightly hopped pale ale. And for that person, maybe Green State isn't the best beer in the world. For me, it is, and it hits, all those boxes that I'm looking for it to hit. But I think, at the end of the day, like going back to, why make those other beers? Because it'd be way less interesting if we were only making one beer. And we're not trying to please everybody, but I think we've done a decent job of capturing some of the most important styles in a really significant and meaningful way. So I don't know if that really gets at the heart of your question, but it's the best I could do on short notice.
Could you have made Green State when you first opened?
I'll tell you what, we were releasing a couple of light lagers back then. Our Munich Helles was, I think, on our original tap list. That's a beer that I go back to. We usually brew that once a year now as a specialty release. I still think it's one of the best beers we've ever made. The Green State, I think we took about 6 or 7 months of perfecting that recipe to get it right where we wanted it, the right balance with the hop and malt balance. And I think we first released that in 2012, maybe 2011, 2012. And I think the palate, the beer public palate was ready for that beer then. And it was certainly, I think, a little ahead of like this current, fascination with Pilsners. I think right now, I'm sure you've seen it too. Like, everybody's talking about Pilsner beer, and we very early on knew that we wanted to make one that we wanted to drink, and we wanted to put it really at the head of our portfolio.
So that brings me back to my question, 9 questions ago. Were there, what's the right word? Were the people who were showing up at, Flatbread, were the people who were showing up at the pub, were they looking for something other than hops? Were they looking for crisp, clean lagers? Because Ashley Carter from Bierstadt has said, lagers on a, 200-year winning streak kind of thing. But like, every year, the beer writers are trying to say this is going to be the year of the lager. And I think that's just because it's been a low humming current of what beer drinkers actually want. Was that the case? Like, were people saying like, cool, like you have like a new black IPA, you have a new Cascadian, you have a new, hazy, you have a new, like, what, but were people just looking for beer flavored beer?
Yeah, they were. I mean, I think, 05.
That was early in this conversation, but I'm sort of just trying to get below the top level of the undercurrent, like of, well, fuck, man, a Pilsner, cool,
right.
I don't know if that's true, but
I don't think people were thinking about them as cool at that point. I think there was a lot of different types of drinkers in Vermont in those early years. And for sure, the cool guys were drinking IPA. I mean, you were asking before, what were those, those guest beers that we were pouring? I totally escaped me, but Dogfish Head was just like king shit of fuck mountain back then, right? It was like the 60-minute, the 90-minute. The Stone beers were coming in from California, and everybody was losing their minds about that. Smutty Nose IPA. Which I think was derivative of Todd Mott, right? Smutty Nose. Yeah, right. Like he was at at
Portsmouth
as well.
He was at Calumet. Right. He was at Portsmouth, and then obviously at Tributary these days, where he's just kicking ass. And
Yeah, but like yeah, so
just kicking ass.
the cool kids were definitely just drinking hops, then too. Like it wasn't the New England or Vermont. We like to make sure we remember that New England IPA started as Vermont IPA. That didn't come along until much later. Back then it was California. West Coast IPAs were still really really the king, and Vermont has a really deeply embedded ski culture and snowboard culture, and we all know that those cultures are packed full of cool kids, and it was all about hops back then. So there was an appetite for lagers and pilsners, but that was the real purists, the beer nerds, the home brewers, the people that a lot of people that went on to start the next wave of craft breweries. I think it would take us a week or two to turn over a 10-barrel tank of our IPA, and it would take us 6 to 8 weeks to turn over a tank of lager, and it would be a very different type of drinker, I think, that was looking for. We were doing Viennas, and we were doing. We've always done the Marzen. That beer, I mean, we could talk for an hour about Oktoberfest. It's had a huge resurgence.
Yeah, but we're not going to do that now because.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, we can.
But, I think to your point, where you're going is pilsners where they are right now is a new thing. It is cool in a way that then it wasn't cool. It was appreciated and loved, but I don't think anybody was feeling really cool about drinking light lager back then.
The cool factor, though, like so much of that speaks to craft beer as a prop. It's the people who are saying it's the Instagram set, or
sure.
Garrett Oliver said a couple of years ago that hazy IPAs were built for Instagram. Let's take pictures of this type of thing. There was a time where people wanted to be seen holding a certain label, or in craft, in the early days, it was, you're a Bud guy, you're a Miller guy, you're a Coors guy, or, person, as it were. But it's an interesting thing of if somebody was showing up at your bar, at your brew pub, do you think they were being judged for the color of the beer in the glass, or the label that was on their glass, versus now?
Mm-hmm. Not so much. No, I mean, I don't know exactly when it started. I think we can probably point to Heady Topper as being a big, important marker on that timeline.
Yeah.
The certainly the idea of a white whale or a hard to get beer existed before Heady Topper, but that was, I think, really the one that accelerated it and launched, made the likes of Treehouse and, all those other of the moment brands that people are trading beers for and standing in lines for and Instagramming, all over town. I think that was the one that really started that type of craze. Before that, I think, the beer trading scene that I witnessed anyways it was usually more about the ones that were hard to get regionally. I remember this guy would come every year to the Vermont Brewers Festival, and he'd bring these beers from Alaskan Brewery, and it was like, wow, this is great. These are beers, beers that we just can't get out here, or the Pliny the Youngers and all those beers that were from California, and just no opportunity to get them. And that was just great to share those styles, but it was not like this who's who list that you had to check off, or have you had this this such and such triple dry hop release from this brewery, and if you hadn't, you just didn't even know, you weren't on the same level. It was that whole thing is a mystery to me. I think maybe because as I was described a few minutes ago about what my ideal drinking experience is, it's so vastly differs from that drinker. I've seen it happen, and I can understand why it's happening, but it's definitely, I'm a little miffed by it still, honestly.
In the top of this conversation, you mentioned early Vermont breweries, and Magic Hat came up, and you sort of had this, at least tonally, a dismissive kind of vibe to it. And a couple months ago, Magic Hat's parent company, which is, I don't know, some sort of conglomerate or something, announced that they were leaving South Burlington. They were going to move all of their production to Rochester, New York, and rather than shutting down the plant, the brewery, you all were taking over.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a sense of loss by a lot of beer drinkers who grew up drinking Magic Hat and who have a fondness for that brand, of which I am one. And at the same time, that press release also soothed a lot of us because, well, that place will continue on making beer like it was intended to, like Alan Newman wanted it to in the early days, and et cetera, et cetera. With your talk of lager, though, one, I want to talk about, like, why that space was appealing to you, but two, what changes you've made to it, because the last time that I was there, and admittedly that was maybe 5 years ago, 5 years ago, I was walking through the open fermentation ale tanks, and you're talking a lot about lager these days, which, that doesn't work. So let's set it up.
Got two words for you, John. Hot tubs. Big hot tubs.
Well, you're going to have to weld some seats to about, like 4 feet from the rim, just so that people don't drown. Otherwise, that just becomes, Soylent Green cooking tanks.
No, it's funny.
How did that come about? How did you all, going from where you were to, the previous Magic Hat facility? How did that happen?
Well, interestingly enough, you mentioned Alan Newman. He's a friend of ours. He's a great guy. He still is in the area. I'm sure you've chatted with him before. He's
once
got
or twice.
Million stories.
Man's got the best eyewear in the business.
He does. You can't miss him. You see him coming a mile away. He's a friend, and we had heard some rumors that he was actually potentially working on a deal of getting back in there and to work on some projects that he was thinking about doing. And I don't remember what I can and can't disclose about that. But the long story short is that his deal kind of fell through. And right around the same time, we had really identified that we were a little bit behind in securing like a real solution for what was a very successful 2018 sales that took our production right up to the limits of what we could produce in our production brewery on Pine Street. And so we had started to pursue some contract relationships for a little pressure relief valve. And the one that we thought we had in line, which was from another local brewery here, won't say who, but it fell through for some different reasons. Nothing bad, but didn't work out. And so we had for a little while considered that maybe Magic Hat wasn't the best place to produce the beers, because some of those maybe perceptions that existed about that brand out there weren't great, and didn't necessarily want to tie ourselves to that. But eventually kind of, dug around a little bit and decided, hey, maybe this could actually be a decent place to make one or two of our products. And at the same time, caught wind that, oh, by the way, this facility could actually be for sale. So we kind of pursued both angles at the same time, established kind of a plan to make some of our beers down there starting in summer of 2020. And then in a parallel track, essentially negotiated, the purchase of that facility. And it all came together during this first 3-4 months of COVID, which is just an absolute blur. We're on these Zoom calls with these guys down in Costa Rica, sorting all this out. And the way that it worked, we inked the deal, I think, July 1st, and we had already brewed a batch of beer via this other contract that we were going to do. So we had beer come out of there like July 6th. It was just like, and it couldn't have happened at a better, like when we literally were just like stretched as thin as you could at Pine Street as far as squeezing every bit of beer. Cause honestly, like we didn't know it at the time, but beer sales weren't really affected by COVID. For a lot of, I know a ton of breweries, that's not the case. And, but for us, a lot of our products were being sold in cans, in the off-premise sector. And that is where sales really increased. So we were under the gun of figuring it out, and it all just came together. The stars aligned for us, I guess you could say.
Is it hard not to think about the new facility as Magic Hats?
We pretty quickly we caught ourselves, referring to it as Magic Hat, down a Magic Hat, and it's right down the road from us, and I remember the last time that I was in Burlington and South Burlington, I left your place, I left the pub and went to Magic Hat. Like it's not far. It's not far at all, honestly. It's we refer to it as Bartlett Bay. That's the road that is on is Bartlett Bay Road. So it's the Bartlett Bay facility. It's currently just being used to make beer. We don't have any kind of on-site tasting or customer experience. That's so specific to Magic Hat. What they built on there was so them. It was such, so tied to that identity and Alan's vision for that brand that it's not something that we would ever try and step into and rebrand necessarily. If we did, it would take a pretty big overhaul. But, one of the beautiful things about that place is that it truly has a world-class system in there. It's a Rolex system that they put in, and kind of, to your question about the square fermenters, they had obviously a big portion of the fermentation space dedicated to the open squares. But they had also recently, I don't know how recent, last 10 years anyways, put on a whole different wing of conical fermentation. Oh yeah, no, those I know, but like on the tour, it was, hey, come check out our open fermentation, make sure your watch is attached to your wrist, like that kind of thing. Yeah. Right. Have you done the tour at Anchor out in San Francisco? Years ago. Yeah. Oh man. I mean, that was my first real exposure to that type of. Yeah. No, they wouldn't let me be on the plexiglass, which was probably a smart thing because, What a beautiful brewery that is, though. I think. Sure. I don't know what the hell they're doing now, but just that was one of the most coolest experiences I've ever had touring a brewery. It was out there at Anchor. They treated us so well. But I think to the question that I asked earlier, though, is like Magic Hat itself had really put its stamp on that location. It wasn't just open fermentation, but it was like, here's our, wacky, low budget Willy Wonka thing to it as well. So, I imagine that there had to have been some refurbishment to put your own stamp on it as well, but to refer to it in-house as the street as opposed to Magic Hat, which I guess you guys were doing earlier. When does a place, or does it feel like home now? Like, does it feel like your house? Yeah, I think if it was non-COVID times, it would even more so, because I think we would have had the opportunity to spend more time together in it and really truly christen it as our own, and have fans come through. Yeah, well, no, honestly, like I don't. Maybe like we at this point we've got no intention to open it to the public as a tasting room. Like it's not interesting. Okay, it's that side of it, what they call the artifactory. That's what I was saying. It's like so specific to Alan's vision for that brand. And honestly, we basically gave him pretty much a free run on any of that stuff that he wanted that FIFCO didn't take. So FIFCO took out like most of the brand, specific stuff, like, old guitars that were signed or things from their Magic Hat day, Mardi Gras parade days and things like that. Like they still own all that stuff. But there was like, all these funky architectural details that they had put in. That we just said to Alan, like, hey, if you want to come get any of this stuff, please do. Like, it, means more to you. And he's working on a project now that he might end up using. So, like, we basically purged all that stuff. And the goal, eventually maybe to clean it up and use it as an event space. We've got some ideas cooking for it that I think could be really fun. But at this point, the face of our brand is on Pine Street now. We've got a great tasting room down there, and the experience I think is fantastic. And that brewery really, it's a production only type space, and it's really well suited for that. The part of town that it's in is kind of, I don't know, there's not really much around it that would promote like, bar hopping or, walking. It's not walkable at all. So it's not a whole lot of desire on our part to make it a customer experience, at least not anytime soon.
Where you guys have started making a non-alcoholic beer,
yes.
Where's the future of that? Like, or what is the trajectory that you'd like to see it follow right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I, the non-alcoholic sector is one that we've been. Sector, is that the right word?
Yeah. I mean, segment, category.
Yeah, category. That non-alcoholic category. Yeah, I like that. It's one that we've been watching for the last 3 or 4 years. We had a friend come to us, I think 4 years ago, who was somebody who was looking for a good NA beer. He was also a very successful investor. And he kind of was like, hey, would you guys be interested in making an NA beer? There's no good ones around here, and I want to drink a good one. And oh, by the way, I'm an investor. I watch this stuff, and I think there's a big future in this too. He was watching
what constitutes a good NA beer? Not to step on your money guy, but what's a shitty NA beer, and what makes for a good one in your mind? As somebody who makes a lager that's the
best beer in the world. Yeah. For sure, one that you drink and you want to reach for another one. That it has that desirability to just sort of blend into the fabric of the evening in a way where you're not overthinking it. It's balanced. It tastes like a beer. In our case, we released, we started the brand, I guess, as kind of a siloed off separate company, thinking from the perspective of Zero Gravity Craft Brewery being known for making world-class craft beer. We came up with the name Rescue Club. So Rescue Club Brewing Company, making world-class non-alcoholic beverages. And we launched with our first, I guess you could call it, flagship product, just early this month for Dry January, and it's an IPA style. So hop forward versus a lot of what you'd seen prior to this recent pop in popularity of NA beers. All NA beers were basically riffs on light lager. The O'Doul's, basically you couldn't get an NA IPA prior to a year or two ago. So, that for us, that was like a step towards, giving the craft beer drinker, somebody that now knows what good craft beer is, a non-alcoholic version. So we're really excited, honestly. You asked where it's going, of the potential to continue to grow that, to different styles. Right now for us, it can only represent a fairly small percentage of our production based on how we're set up to make it. We, I can't tell you exactly how we do it, but it requires a process that we only have the capability to do in our Pine Street facility. So if we wanted to really scale it up, it would require another investment to put the equivalent larger stuff down at Bartlett Bay. So for us, it's kind of a feather in the cap as far as what we're doing with Zero Gravity at large, and something that we're gonna take a close look at over the next 6 to 12 months and decide just how serious we think this can be and how interested people are, and if all the signs are good, well, I think we'll continue to invest and grow that part of it. But it's we see a lot of really cool synergies happening between the cannabis industry and the NA beer stuff right now that I think would be a really interesting way to take it. Certainly a lot of people in your field, writing about it and talking about it. So I think there's interest there. I think if you look at the numbers, it's still a very, very small fraction of the overall beer world. But I can't tell you, I haven't seen people as excited about something that we've done in a really long time. So there's definitely something to it. I think there's a lot of people that never thought that they would drink non-alcoholic beer. I'm one of them who are now kind of interested in it. I don't know about you, but
Yeah.
I've actually drank a few.
No, I have as well. And
Yeah.
I mean, there's an appeal to it as long as it tastes good. So and I haven't had yours yet, so like I can't
Well, we'll have to
extol like you do as to the oh my gosh, the best in the world. Matt, thanks for taking the time and sitting down on the podcast today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been my pleasure.
That's Matt Wilson of Zero Gravity. If you haven't yet, pick up some of their beers and try for yourself. And if you have, well, go get some more. A bit of housekeeping before we go. Make sure to head over to Facebook and join the This Week in Rausch Beer group, because there's always something smoky going on. And if beer audio is your thing, make sure you listen to the Beer Edge podcast with Andy Crouch for deep dive conversations with interesting brewery owners and more. Also, head over to beeredge.com for articles and to sign up for the newsletter. Plus, you should follow us on all of the social media sites at The Beer Edge. Every Monday, look for a new episode of Steal This Beer, and once a month, download the BYO Nano podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe to this show and to leave a review. You can always reach me via email at John Holl, that's JOHNHOLL at beeredge.com, or on Twitter at John_Holl. Nate Schweber does the music, and if you haven't yet, check out his new album called Gaps, where you can find that at nateschweber.bandcamp.com. Jeff Quinn designed our logo. And if you're interested in advertising on this show, you can reach out to Liz Melby. She's at liz@beeredge.com. I'm John Holl. New episodes of this show release every Wednesday, and that's when we'll be back again to drink beer and to think beer.